you ever walk into a place and just feel wrong? Like you're trespassing somewhere you're not supposed to be, even though nobody's around? That's exactly how I felt when my father and I stepped into the ruins of Belchite. I was born into a Spanish-American household, spending the first few years of my life in Zaragoza, Spain. My parents moved us to Austin, Texas when I was 3, but we returned to Zaragoza every summer to visit family. Those summers were the best part of my childhood. Sun-drenched days, long siestas, and endless exploration of the countryside. Even as a kid, I was fascinated by the supernatural. While other kids played football or collected trading cards, I was glued to old books about haunted places. The idea of spirits trapped in forgotten corners of the world enthralled me. I often pestered my cousins with tales of ghostly encounters I read about, but they mostly laughed it off. Then, during one summer visit when I was 14, my father and I had an experience that changed the way I saw the world forever. It started with a casual conversation over dinner at my aunt's apartment. I had just finished rambling about some haunted castle I read about, when my uncle, with a glimmer in his eye, mentioned Belchite. "You want to see something truly haunted, Carlos?" he said, leaning forward. "Go to Belchite." I had never heard of it. He explained that Belchite was a ghost town, about 45 minutes from Zaragoza, left in ruins after the Spanish Civil War. In just 2 weeks, over 6,000 people died there during a brutal battle in 1937. The entire town was reduced to rubble. The few survivors were ordered to leave, and instead of rebuilding it, Franco, the leader of Spain at the time, turned it into a monument of war. To this day, it remains frozen in time. Intrigued, I begged my father to take me. The next day, he agreed. We set off in a small rental car, driving through the sun-baked countryside. The road to Belchite felt oddly desolate. No cars, no signs of life, just rolling hills and the occasional stone farmhouse. I noticed that the soil seemed to change color the closer we got, from golden brown to a deep, almost rust red. We finally spotted the crumbling silhouette of the town on the horizon. Jagged church towers, hollowed-out buildings, and crooked archways stood defiantly against the sky. It was haunting even from a distance. We parked near a chain-link fence that surrounded the ruins. The gate was open and no one seemed to be around. My father and I stepped through and walked into the remains of Belchite. We wandered through the skeletal remains of the old church first. Its ceiling was long gone, leaving the stone arches exposed to the sky. Faded frescoes of angels stared down with vacant eyes from the crumbling walls. Their expressions seemed almost sorrowful. I wondered how many people had gathered under this roof praying for salvation before it collapsed. At first, the only sound was the wind whistling through the hollowed buildings. Then, faintly, I heard something else. A distant popping sound, sharp and rhythmic. It almost sounded like gunfire. I glanced at my father. "Did you hear that?" He nodded but brushed it off. "Probably just some kid setting off fireworks nearby," he muttered. But it didn't sound like fireworks. As we walked further into the ruins, I heard it again, louder this time. The unmistakable crack of rifles. I spun around, scanning the horizon. Nothing. Only the empty ruins and cloudless sky. My father saw the confusion on my face. "Must be a trick of the wind," he muttered. But I saw the tension in his eyes. We eventually wandered down a narrow street where the ruins of old homes leaned into one another like broken teeth. We passed a small stream near a mound of rubble where a fig tree grew. The sight of the tree offered a strange sense of comfort, so I approached it and reached for a fig. Just as I plucked one from the branch, I noticed something odd. tiny ants crawling out of the bottom of every fig. It was unnerving, as if the fruit itself was rotting from within. My father, clearly spooked, suggested we keep moving. But as we turned to leave, my eyes caught on something near the rubble. A tiny, dust-covered shoe. It was old and worn. It would probably fit a 7 or 8-year-old boy. I crouched down, brushing the dust away, and without really thinking, slipped it into my jacket pocket. A part of me knew it was wrong, but I convinced myself it was just an old relic. A harmless souvenir. As the sun began to set, we made our way back toward the town square. The fading light made the ruins seem even more sinister. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, and the empty windows grew darker like hollow eyes watching us. Just as we were about to leave, I caught a faint flicker of light from a second-story apartment window. It was brief, like the quick spark of a lighter. I nudged my father, but he responded with a confused glance. He hadn't seen it. "Someone's up there," I whispered. "But there couldn't be," my dad murmured, glancing at me before cautiously moving closer to the building. I stood frozen behind him, my breath caught in my throat. The back of the building was completely destroyed, the floorboards long rotted away. No one could have been standing there. "Think you're just being paranoid," my father said half-jokingly, trying to pacify me out of my fear. Back at my aunt's apartment, I dumped my bag onto the nightstand. The little shoe tumbled out, landing beside my camera. I grabbed it and dropped it down by the nightstand. I flipped through my photos. My hands shook slightly as I saw dozens of orbs floating through the frames, some faint, others sharp and distinct. Still feeling on edge, I decided to take a shower, hoping the hot water would wash away the lingering unease. But as I stood beneath the stream, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. My mind kept drifting back to the crumbling ruins, the distant echoes of gunfire, and that eerie, glowing light. Afterward, I joined my father and aunt at the small wooden table in the kitchen. We shared a simple dinner, pan-fried chorizo with warm bread and olives, while recounting our excursion. My father, with a gleam of excitement in his eyes, described the haunting beauty of Belchite. The weathered stone archways, the bullet-ridden walls, and the strange stillness that clung to the place. My aunt, however, was less enthusiastic. She shook her head and warned us that we should have never gone there. Her voice lowered slightly as she muttered something about los muertos, the dead, not taking kindly to being disturbed. Despite her ominous tone, I felt a strange calm settle over me, maybe from the warmth of the meal or simply the comfort of being around family. But as the night wore on, fatigue weighed heavily on me. With a full stomach and a clouded mind, I retreated to my room, ready to sleep off the day's exhaustion. I went to bed exhausted that night, drifting into a restless sleep, but it didn't last long. In my sleep, I dreamt that I was wide awake. As I lay there in the stillness of my dream, I saw a little boy standing next to my bed. His face was pale and streaked with dirt, his hair matted and unkempt. He wore tattered clothes that clung to his thin frame, and his vacant eyes locked onto mine with a haunting emptiness. His small, cracked lips parted slightly, and in a faint, broken voice he whispers, "Mi zapato?" My shoe, in Spanish. I jolted awake, my skin clammy with sweat. Okay, good, just a dream, I thought, trying to calm myself. My breath came in shallow, panicked gasps. For a moment I sat frozen, gripping the blanket with trembling hands, my ears straining for any sound in the dark room. Then I remembered the shoe. I turned toward the nightstand, expecting to see it where I had left it. But it was gone. My eyes frantically scanned the room, and then I saw it. lying in the opposite corner, half hidden in the shadows near the door. My stomach twisted into knots. I knew I hadn't placed it there. My hands shook as I stood up, walked over and grabbed the shoe. The dusty leather felt cold against my fingers. Without a second thought, I stumbled to the balcony, my legs unsteady beneath me. I flung the shoe with all my strength, watching it arc through the night air before it clattered onto the roof of some car in the parking lot, about 70 feet away from where I was standing. I stayed on the balcony, gripping the railing with white-knuckled hands, staring at where the shoe had landed, as if I was waiting for it to move again. I eventually returned to bed, but I couldn't fall asleep until the first hints of dawn peeked over the horizon. Only then, utterly exhausted, did I finally drift off. I was so tired from staying up all night that I didn't wake until around noon. My dad later told me he had knocked on my door a couple of times when I was sleeping, but I never responded. I told him what had happened, the strange dream and the shoe that moved. Yeah, my story freaked the hell out of him too. I never saw the shoe anywhere in the parking lot again, but even if I did, I wouldn't even dare try to touch it again. I'll tell you this, if you ever visit Belchite, admire the ruins, take your photos, but don't take anything with you. Some things are meant to be left undisturbed.
Three generations, gone in less than 24 hours. A father, a mother, their unborn grandchild. All claimed by tragedy. It started with a daughter in labor, her unborn child lost to a fatal miscarriage. Just hours later, her parents, Henry and Evelyn, died in a horrific car crash while rushing to the hospital. Their bodies were brought to the very place where their daughter and grandchild had just been pronounced dead.
I'm not one to believe in ghosts. Or at least I wasn't before I met Henry. I worked as a hospice nurse for a small palliative care service in Maple Ridge, Kansas, a quiet, rural town where nothing much happened except for crop rotations and county fairs. The kind of place where folks still left their doors unlocked at night. It was my second year on the job when I was sent to Maple Ridge Memorial, an old hospital about 30 miles from where I lived. I remember being surprised the first time I pulled into the gravel lot. It didn't look abandoned, but it felt forgotten. The bricks were sun-faded, the windows weathered by decades of storms. Inside, the hospital was clean but stuck in the past. Linoleum floors and muted green and pale yellow tiles gave the hallways a dull, outdated look. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, flickering now and then. It was like stepping into the 1950s. I had been called in for a patient named Margaret Reed, who was nearing the end. It was around 3 a.m. when I arrived, typical for these calls. The hospital's night shift was sparse. A few tired nurses, a receptionist, and 2 aides. I checked in and headed toward Margaret's room. As I was walking toward Margaret's room, I was flipping through her file, reviewing her charts and notes. My eyes flicked up briefly, scanning the hallway ahead, then dropped back to the papers in my hand. I vaguely noticed a man standing further down the corridor, but I didn't think much of it. Just another visitor, I figured. As I drew closer, I kept my eyes on Margaret's file, but something nagged at the edge of my awareness. A subtle wrongness I couldn't immediately place. It wasn't until I was nearly passing him that I truly registered his presence. He was near the end of the corridor, by the glass, looking outside at the parking lot. An older man, mid-60s maybe, wearing overalls and a faded plaid shirt. His hands were tucked into his pockets, and he had this lost, vacant expression as though he didn't know where he was or why he was there. It was only when I glanced back over my shoulder, feeling a faint twinge of curiosity, that I realized something strange. He was gone. Just gone. The hallway was empty. I stopped mid-step, blinking at the vacant space where he'd been. My gaze drifted toward the window, half expecting to see him outside in the lot. But there was no one there. Only rain streaking the glass and the faint reflection of my own confused face staring back at me. I shook it off and continued down the corridor, but a chill had settled in my chest. Something about that man didn't feel right, and I couldn't shake the unsettling sense that I had just walked past someone who wasn't really there. I stood frozen, my breath caught somewhere between a gasp and a scream. My hands were trembling as I finally stumbled into the nurse's station. One of the nurses, a stout woman named Carla, took one look at me and let out a sharp laugh. "Oh ho, looks like you've met old Henry," she teased. The aides smirked. One of them rolled her eyes. Clearly, they'd seen this before. Carla clapped me on the shoulder, still chuckling. "Don't worry, he's harmless." My throat was dry. Who is he?" She leaned against the counter and nodded down the hall. "Henry Jacobson. Died in a car wreck with his wife about 30 years back. Their daughter was going through a difficult delivery in this hospital. When Henry and his wife heard the news, they rushed out to get to her, but they never made it." The hallway felt colder suddenly. Carla went on, unfazed. "Folks say Henry shows up before someone dies, like a—" She snapped her fingers. "A harbinger or whatever. Harmless, really, just lost." One of the aides, Jill, perked up and walked over to a supply closet. She returned holding a porcelain baby doll in a white christening gown. Its eyes were the old-fashioned kind that blinked when you tilted it. Jill set it carefully on the counter. I stared at her. "What is that for?" Carla's face softened a little. "That was for the maternity ward. After Henry died, they shut that whole section down. It's empty now, but we leave the doll in the old delivery room." I stayed on at Maple Ridge Memorial for another year. I saw Henry 2 more times, always before a patient passed. Each time, he was the same, distant, sorrowful, and lost. One night, out of curiosity, I asked Carla why the doll kept Henry away. She gave me a sad, knowing look. "Henry was on his way here for his daughter," she said softly. "She died giving birth. He never got to hold his grandbaby. I think when he sees the doll, it makes him think he did." Her voice broke slightly, but she smiled. "I like to think it gives him a little peace, just for a while." Today, I no longer work at Maple Ridge, but I still think of Henry sometimes. What a sad story, and a big heart he had. I imagine him wandering those dim hallways, searching for faces he'll never find, watching over strangers who will never know his name. A lost soul, forever waiting, still trying to reach his daughter.